They came just after midnight. No warning. No explanation. Sirens slicing through the silence, red and blue lights bouncing off the trees like some surreal dream sequence. Vehicles rolled in with the confidence of people who expected no resistance. Uniforms stepped out like they were entering a war zone. They said they were law enforcement, but I've seen real cops before, and these people weren't it. Something was off, their posture, their gear, the way they moved. Like actors in a low-budget play, just convincing enough for an audience that doesn't know better. And the strangest part? This wasn't about drugs, or violence, or stolen property. No, this was about a fence. 6 inches of steel mesh above a supposed community guideline limit. Apparently, that made me public enemy number 1. A man living alone in a log cabin at the edge of the Montana wilderness had suddenly become the target of an orchestrated power play over 6 inches of metal. That's all it took to wake the beast. I still don't know what they were expecting that night. Maybe they thought I'd surrender like some guilty man with a closet full of secrets. Or maybe they didn't know who was sleeping inside that cabin. Maybe they didn't know I spent 30 years as a mountain security consultant and wilderness survival instructor, training some of the toughest units in the world. Or maybe they didn't care. Either way, what happened next? That changed everything. Let me ask you something. Ever had a neighbor try to ruin your life over something small? Something petty? I mean something so absurd, it borders on satire? If you have, drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. I'm Marcus. I'm 65 years old, and I came to the wilds of Montana looking for peace. Not silence. Not isolation. Peace. The kind that you feel in your bones when the world stops yelling for a second and lets you just exist. After decades working in some of the most unforgiving environments on earth, I thought I'd earned that. Thought I'd bought it, really, paid for in sweat, broken bones, and friends lost along the way. But peace, I've learned, is a luxury. And not everyone wants you to have it. 5 years ago, I lost my best friend, Tom. Not to an avalanche, or a firefight, or some freak wilderness accident. No, he was destroyed by something far more insidious, an HOA. Yeah, that's right. A homeowners association. Those little neighborhood governments that pretend to keep things tidy while they tighten nooses made of bureaucracy. They harassed him to death. Slowly. Deliberately. With a smile. I'll never forget the sound of his voice the last time we spoke. Weak, trembling, barely more than a whisper over the phone. They won't stop, Mark. They just won't stop. He was out of breath, and out of strength. And the worst part? He was out of hope. Every day they hit him with a new fine, a new complaint, a new demand. Paint too faded. Grass too tall. Flag too worn. Noise too loud. Fence too high. One by one, they chipped away at his sanity until nothing was left but a shell of the man I knew. Tom had survived war zones, mountain rescues, and bitter winters. But he didn't survive them. After he passed, alone and broken, I made a promise to myself. A sacred one. Never again. No friend of mine would suffer under that kind of tyranny. Not while I was alive. And certainly not me. I started searching for a place where I could disappear. Somewhere far from city councils, parking violations, and nosy neighbors who care more about lawn length than human decency. That's when I found the cabin. A 2-bedroom log structure nestled at the foot of Snowshoe Peak, surrounded by dense pine and whispering aspens. The kind of place where the wind tells stories and the stars keep secrets. It was perfect. Remote, resilient, and untouched by the rules of civilization. Or so I thought. I poured my soul into that cabin. Every nail, every beam, every wire, installed with care and intention. I built it not just for myself, but for the memories I wanted to honor. Tom would have loved it. I even put in a state-of-the-art security system so my military buddies could visit for what we call hunting therapy. The winters are cruel up here, and I made sure the place could stand against them. My days began with the cries of hawks and ended with the scent of pine smoke. I felt alive for the first time in decades. The chain-link fence was already there when I bought the place. Nothing extravagant. About 5 feet tall, weathered from years of snow and sun, running along the western property line. It kept out deer and the occasional curious bear from what I intended to turn into a vegetable garden. I reinforced a few spots, tightened the wire, made it stable. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? This wasn't some fancy subdivision. It was the edge of the world. But fences, I would come to learn, are more than just boundaries. They are symbols. And someone didn't like mine. Her name was Dolores. Imagine someone who walks like they own the land their shadow falls on. Mid-50s, bleach blonde hair that doesn't move even in a storm, lipstick sharp enough to slice paper, and eyes that could read the fine print on your soul. Dolores used to run the local women's club until a financial discrepancy booted her from the social elite. No charges filed, but word around town was she misplaced several $1,000s meant for a children's charity. Classy. Now she clings to the title of HOA chairwoman like it's a throne. Her kingdom? A loose collection of cabins and homes that barely count as a neighborhood. But to her, it might as well be Versailles. Power, control, relevance, she drinks them like wine. She showed up at my door 3 weeks after I moved in. Clipboard in hand. Smile plastered on like stage makeup. Said she was here to welcome me to the community. I should have sent her packing. Instead, I offered her coffee. Stupid me, still thinking neighborliness meant something. She sat in my kitchen like she was casing the place. Her eyes never stopped moving. From my military plaques to the security monitors, to the bookshelf stacked with field manuals. She complimented the view, then criticized the insulation. Asked about the cameras, so many, for such a safe area. Then asked about my past. Where did you serve? What kind of weapons did you train with? Will there be many male visitors? She was fishing. Probing. Looking for something she could use. I gave her nothing. But I saw it, even then. The way she kept glancing toward the fence line. That faint curl of her lip when she talked about aesthetic uniformity. When she left, I stood on my porch and watched her walk back to her car, a shiny little SUV with a vanity plate that said Queen. And something in my gut told me she wasn't done. Not even close. I was right. A week later, a certified letter landed in my mailbox. Fancy envelope. Gold seal. Inside, a notice. My fence was in violation of HOA regulation #42.3b, maximum height, 4 feet. Mine? 4 feet, 6 inches. I had 7 days to remove it or face escalating penalties. Attached was a glossy business card for Montana-bound construction, owned by none other than Dolores's nephew, Travis. I nearly laughed. The absurdity was cosmic. In a land where wolves howl at the moon and snow buries cars whole, someone was worried about a 6-inch fence discrepancy. But this wasn't about fence height. It never was. It was about power. Control. Intimidation. I didn't comply. Instead, I sent a respectful but firm response. The fence was pre-existing. It posed no threat, visual or otherwise. And I'd be reviewing the matter with my longtime legal friend, Ralph Sharp, ex-JG and currently retired, but just the kind of sharp-toothed mind these types fear. Mentioning Ralph's name was like lighting a match near a powder keg. The moment I hit send, I knew the war had begun. And wars like this? They don't end with court dates or apologies. They end when one side gives up. And I wasn't about to. I had absolutely no idea what Dolores was really planning behind those perfectly painted doors and her permanent politician smile. At first, I mistook her silence for acceptance, maybe even a retreat. But in hindsight, I realize now it was the silence before the first shot. The kind of silence that hums with tension, like the moments before a storm finally cracks open the sky. The kind of quiet that doesn't last. The harassment began the very next week, swift and unrelenting like a well-organized military campaign. And let me tell you, Dolores didn't come to play. She launched her attack with bureaucratic precision. First came a wave of certified letters. Each one carried legal language that was designed to intimidate, with phrases like non-compliance penalties, imminent legal action, and community standards violation. They arrived in thick envelopes with bold seals and crisp letterheads that mimicked official government correspondence, hoping to scare me into submission. Some people might have folded. But I've dealt with real threats before, the kind that don't come with a return address. Then came the email flood. My inbox exploded with digital harassment. Notices demanding immediate corrective action, digital citations for so-called landscape irregularities, and hollow threats of daily fines filled my account like a virus. It was like opening a tap of HOA venom. And the ridiculousness didn't stop there. According to Dolores, my firewood stack was improperly aligned, my mailbox needed repainting, and, get this, my bird feeder was encouraging undesirable wildlife patterns. Yes, apparently feeding birds was now a punishable offense. The more absurd the claims became, the more obvious it was, this wasn't about community upkeep. This was about dominance. Control. She was throwing every piece of fabricated nonsense she could think of at me, hoping I'd trip, panic, or surrender. She counted on the volume, on the psychological fatigue. For, Sometimes 5 letters or emails would arrive in a single day. Each one more creatively false than the last. Most people would have cracked under that kind of pressure, and that was exactly what she wanted. But it didn't stop at digital warfare. That's when she escalated to fake inspections. One afternoon, I found a paper tacked to my front gate, an environmental violation report. According to the document, my property was now considered a localized ecological hazard. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. The report alleged that my septic system was leaking into protected soil, that my solar panel batteries were emitting illegal frequencies, and that my vegetable garden was altering local deer migration patterns. I had to read it twice just to make sure it wasn't a parody. But when I examined the report more closely, my laughter faded. The document had official-looking signatures from agencies that didn't exist. The names were all unverifiable. The contact numbers were disconnected. It was a total fabrication, but a dangerous one. Someone had spent a lot of time designing these forgeries to look real. Dolores wasn't just petty, she was methodical. She was waging psychological warfare with forged documents and legal theater. Even with all that, I might have brushed it off, chalked her up as just another power-drunk suburban tyrant. But then Frank stopped by. Frank had lived in this part of Montana for over 2 decades. Salt-of-the-earth guy. Former game warden. Quiet, practical, and the kind of man who could identify a bird call or track a grizzly through 3 feet of snow without blinking. He'd always been cordial, but distant. We kept things neighborly, nods at the mailbox, quick conversations at the local supply store. That day, I was splitting firewood when he wandered over, looking uneasy. He didn't even bother with small talk. Just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, and said, "You should let it go, Marcus. Just take the fence down. You can't win against her." It was the look in his eyes that got me. Not anger. Not frustration. Just this haunted resignation. Like a man who'd already fought the war and lost. He went on to tell me, quietly, nervously, that I wasn't the first. That Dolores had pulled this kind of stunt before. 3 families had already moved away in the last 2 years after similar treatment. He didn't know all the details, but he knew enough. Harassment, fake fines, property devaluations, even threats of foreclosure. Dolores had turned the HOA into a weapon. A bureaucratic wrecking ball aimed at anyone who didn't obey. "She's got connections," he said, voice low. "Judges, clerks, realtors. You cross her, and things start to happen. Unexplainable things." I thanked him for the warning, but my mind was already racing. I'd fought real wars. I'd stood against men with guns, men with bombs, men with nothing to lose. But I'd never seen this quiet, paper-driven destruction that looked harmless on the surface but was designed to ruin people from the inside out. That was the moment I knew, this wasn't just about offense. This was about control. She needed to dominate this community like a queen with her tiny paper crown. Then things got strange. About a week later, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. Immaculate paint job. Government plates. Out stepped a man in an expensive tailored suit, dark sunglasses, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Said his name was Michael. No last name. Just Michael. He claimed to be a writer, working on a novel about mountain life, and wanted to rent the cabin for a few quiet days of solitude. I smelled the lie instantly. His shoes were too polished, his hands too soft. He didn't carry himself like a writer, he carried himself like a Fed. Or worse, a private contractor. He asked too many questions. How long had I lived there? Did I often have guests? What kind of security did I use to protect such a remote place? When he asked about my cameras and motion sensors, alarm bells went off in my head. I told him I wasn't interested. He left a card with only a number, no company name, no email. Just a name written in tight, controlled script and a phone number. I waited until he left, then took a photo of the card and sent it to someone I trusted. That someone was Ralph Sharp. Ralph and I go way back. We served together years ago, and after his time in uniform, he became one of the best legal and security minds in the state. I told him everything, about Dolores, the letters, the fake violations, the mystery man. When I finished, Ralph was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This isn't about revenge. It's bigger. HOAs don't escalate this fast unless there's money involved, or power." That chilled me more than anything else. Ralph doesn't scare easy. If he was worried, I had every reason to be. He promised to dig deeper, and in the meantime, he told me to watch my back. "This isn't just a fence war," he said. "It's something coordinated. They're testing you." And test me they did. The surveillance started shortly after. Dolores's SUV began cruising past my cabin more frequently. Sometimes she had a passenger. Once, I caught them holding a DSLR camera pointed at my property. A week later, I noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near the tree line, watching. No plates. Tinted windows. The kind of stakeouts they teach you to recognize in military counter-surveillance training. Binoculars. Camera lenses. Waiting. I rerouted my security feeds. Adjusted trail cameras. Switched up my daily routines. The air around my cabin felt different. Thicker. Tense. The trees watched me. And I watched back. I knew I needed backup. It just so happened 6 of my old teammates were planning our annual hunting trip. I called them. Suggested a change of venue. Montana instead of Wyoming this year. They didn't ask questions. They packed their bags. They arrived 3 days later, quiet, composed, alert. These men had spent decades in special operations, and though most had since retired, none had gone soft. You could see it in the way they scanned every room before entering. The way they moved like a pack, never loud, never obvious, but always watching. Within hours of arriving, they knew something was off. I didn't tell them everything right away. Just enough to set the mood. I didn't need to say more. They felt it. You can't fake that kind of atmosphere. The tension hangs in the air like a tripwire, and these men knew how to spot traps in the dark. We spent our days hiking, cooking, and sitting by the fire. At night, we monitored. Watched. Logged activity. It felt like we were back on deployment, except now the enemy wore business suits and carried clipboards instead of rifles. Then it happened. 3 days in, at exactly 2:47 a.m., my alarm system erupted like an air raid siren. It jolted me awake with the kind of force that warps time. I was on my feet before my eyes were fully open. I rushed to the monitors, pulse racing, brain already calculating possible threats. What I saw on the screen made my blood turn to ice. 3 police cruisers were in my driveway, lights flashing, engines running. 10 uniformed officers were advancing in formation, moving quickly toward my front door like they were storming a compound. The red and blue glow danced across the snow-covered ground, and the lead officer had something in his hand. And at that moment, I knew. This wasn't about offense anymore. This was a takedown. And someone was about to make a serious mistake. From a distance, their badges gleamed with enough shine to convince anyone watching. Their uniforms were clean, tactical, and regulation perfect, if regulation was just something printed off a movie prop list. But even before I studied their faces, even before I looked into their eyes or heard a single word, something deep in my gut told me this wasn't right. Years of combat service, years of high-stakes missions in hostile territories, you develop a sixth sense for these moments. It was the formation that gave them away first. Too aggressive, too tight, too deliberate. You don't roll up 10 deep in 3 cruisers in the dead of night for a property code violation. Then there was the timing. Always, it's the timing that screams the truth. No warning, no notice. Just sirens at 2:47 a.m. and boots hitting my gravel like they were staging a raid on a drug den. This wasn't standard procedure. Not for real police. Not without probable cause, warrants, or even a courtesy knock. And yet, what twisted my stomach into knots wasn't just the suspicion that they were fake, it was the possibility that they weren't. What if these were real officers? What if they'd been manipulated, fed misinformation by Dolores and her circle of sycophants? What if they genuinely believed they were responding to an emergency, a dangerous threat? The idea that good men could be used like pawns, dragged into someone else's vendetta, it made me sick. And worse, what if they were real but didn't know when to stop? What if someone made the wrong move? What if one of my friends got hurt? Or worse? That was the first time I felt real fear since this war started. Not the anxious kind. The real kind. The kind that tightens your lungs and quickens your pulse and makes every second feel like glass cracking under your feet. My hand found its way to the deadbolt without thinking, instinct overriding hesitation. I stood at the door, palm on the lock, heart pounding like the beat of a war drum. And all I could hear was Tom's voice in the back of my head, whispering from some sacred place in my memory, "Don't let them win, Marcus." For a second, I almost gave in. I'm not too proud to admit that. The weight of everything, the endless harassment, the pressure, the fear of escalating something I couldn't walk back, it had been building. I wasn't wearing body armor. I wasn't in a unit. I wasn't on a mission. I was just a man standing in his cabin, exhausted, protecting 6 friends who were asleep inside. That deadbolt was more than a lock. It was a choice. Fight, or fold. But I didn't fold. I stepped back from the door and walked straight to the control panel near the fireplace. My fingers moved without hesitation, activating the cabin's loudspeaker system. I grabbed the microphone and forced my voice to stay calm. "Welcome to my property, uninvited guests," I said, my voice projecting through every speaker around the perimeter. "I know exactly who you are and who sent you. The real authorities have already been contacted and are en route. I suggest you leave immediately." I paused, watching them through the security monitor. They didn't move. If anything, they grew more determined. One of them lifted a battering ram and began pounding at the door like he had a warrant. Others fanned out across the property, surrounding the cabin like a tactical team preparing to breach. I knew then that words wouldn't be enough. That's when the door opened, slowly, deliberately, and 6 figures in black tactical gear stepped outside. No introductions. No theatrics. Just presence. My team. Former Navy SEALs, each one of them trained beyond what most people will ever comprehend. The kind of men who don't need to raise their voices because their silence speaks volumes. They didn't posture. They didn't flex. They just stood there, calm as the moonlight, assessing the situation like seasoned wolves watching a pack of coyotes circle their den. The reaction was instant. The officers froze mid-movement, as if the temperature dropped 20 degrees. You could see it in their body language, the twitch, the hesitation, the flicker of doubt in their eyes. They'd been sold a lie. Told this would be easy. A soft target. An old man with a fence and a few friends playing soldier. They didn't expect this. They didn't expect a team of real warriors with discipline in their blood and purpose in their steps. There was a moment, silent, tense, where the mountain wind was the only thing moving. Pine trees rustled like a whisper from the earth itself, as if nature was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Then my team moved. 2 walked toward the intruders with perfect coordination, arms relaxed, palms open, non-threatening but confident. The others split off in opposite directions, cutting off exit routes. It was like watching a well-rehearsed drill. Not one word spoken. Just eye contact and decades of training guiding every movement. The cops didn't know what hit them. 3 of the men dropped to the ground almost immediately, taken down in smooth, controlled holds. No violence. No unnecessary force. Just clean, professional restraint that neutralized threats without causing harm. The rest panicked. 2 ran for their vehicles and were intercepted before they got 10 feet. 1 tried to draw a weapon, but my guy disarmed him before it cleared the holster. 30 seconds. That's how long it took. 30 seconds for the entire operation to collapse like a house of cards in the wind. I stayed in the shadows, watching it all unfold, heart still hammering, but no longer from fear. What I felt now was pride. Deep, solid, unshakable pride. These men, these brothers, had come all this way just to be here, just to help me. And they saved my life without being asked. The real sheriff showed up not long after. Sirens cutting through the early morning quiet, headlights illuminating the faces of the fake officers now zip-tied and sitting on the ground, silent and broken. The county boys were thorough and professional. They took statements. Called for backup. Ran plates and found out those cruisers were old decommissioned patrol cars repainted for effect. And then Ralph showed up. He stepped out of his truck grinning from ear to ear, holding a camcorder like it was an Oscar. He'd captured the whole thing from his dashcam and couldn't wait to get it into evidence. The way he looked at me said it all. We've got them now. By the time the sun came up, word had already started spreading. Small towns move fast. By morning, everyone from the bakery cashier to the mechanic at the gas station knew Dolores had orchestrated an illegal raid on my property with fake cops and stolen gear. She'd crossed the line, and she did it in the dumbest way possible, publicly, violently, and without a safety net. I thought that was the end of it. I thought she'd finally be forced to step down, to apologize, to disappear back into whatever hole she'd crawled out of. But I was wrong. She didn't retreat. She rebranded. 2 days later, Dolores held a press conference outside the community park. New banners. A fresh dress. Professional photographers. She stood under a brand new sign announcing the start of a $75,000 community beautification initiative, fully funded by reserve HOA money. Park upgrades, pool renovations, street maintenance, and more. The media showed up. Local news outlets. Bloggers. Freelancers. And there she was. Grinning like she was Mother Teresa with a real estate license. She cut the ribbon while children played behind her and reporters asked softball questions. Not one mention of the fake cops. Not one word about her midnight raid. Just scripted lines about preserving community values and moving past division. I watched the whole thing on TV, jaw clenched. She was spinning the narrative like a pro. Rewriting the story before the ink was even dry. And the worst part? People believed it. Neighbors who had avoided me after the incident were now showing up at HOA events. Praise filled the community board. Comments online talked about her vision and dedication. I'd gone from the man who stood his ground to the man who wouldn't get with the program. She had successfully painted herself as the hero. And for a moment, just a moment, I doubted myself. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I'd let paranoia and grief warp my judgment. Maybe the war I was fighting was long over, and I just hadn't noticed. That seed of doubt crept in like a shadow under the door. It stayed with me while I walked my property that night, while I stared up at the stars trying to remember who I was and why I'd come here. But then I saw the fence. My fence. The one Dolores had tried to destroy me over. And I remembered Tom. I remembered what silence had cost him. I remembered that voice telling me not to give up. And just like that, the doubt disappeared. This war wasn't over. It had only just begun. By the time the next week rolled around, Ralph had undergone a transformation that was nothing short of astonishing. The mild-mannered neighbor who used to politely wave from across the street had turned into a one-man army for justice, armed with a clipboard, a tablet full of HOA bylaws, and a righteous fury in his step. It was like watching a gentle librarian morph into a storm-chasing auditor overnight. He wasted no time. Every day after work and well into the evening, Ralph went door to door, rain or shine, knocking on every house in the neighborhood, collecting signatures for an emergency HOA meeting. The goal? To demand a full-scale financial audit of the HOA and initiate a no-confidence vote against Dolores. But what neither of us fully realized at the time was just how much pressure had been simmering under the surface of this so-called quiet neighborhood. The floodgates didn't just crack, they burst wide open. At first, I expected a slow, reluctant trickle of support. I figured some folks might sign just to be polite but wouldn't want to get involved. But that's not what happened. It was as if Ralph's clipboard became a confession booth. Neighbors who had once smiled nervously and kept their heads down suddenly opened their doors and poured their hearts out. People had stories. Dozens of them. All eerily similar. And many even worse than I could have imagined. One elderly woman, Mrs. Kalinski, who had lived here for over 4 decades, broke down in tears the moment Ralph explained what we were doing. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the doorframe for support, whispering about how Dolores had been harassing her for months, threatening her with fines and repair citations for issues she didn't even understand. Dolores had told her repeatedly that the foundation of her home was unstable, that it would collapse in the next 5 years, and that she'd be better off selling before the liability ruined her children's inheritance. The woman had been losing sleep, terrified she'd die homeless because she couldn't afford the repairs that Dolores insisted were required. She wasn't just scared, she was emotionally exhausted. Then there was Frank, the neighbor who once warned me to just follow the rules and keep your head down. For weeks, he'd kept his distance. But now he admitted something that explained the fear I'd seen in his eyes. He too had been receiving threatening letters, citations for utterly absurd violations. His sprinkler supposedly made too much noise. His dog barked at wildlife. His pickup truck was parked at an unsightly angle. It was harassment. Plain and simple. And he had endured it silently, believing he was the only one being targeted. That's when the ugly truth started to emerge. This wasn't just about me. Dolores had been systematically abusing her power for years, weaponizing the HOA against anyone who stood in her way, anyone who didn't bow down to her control. The more Ralph uncovered, the more the pattern became horrifyingly clear. But Dolores wasn't done. Just as we were building momentum, she launched one of her most personal and malicious attacks yet. In a move straight out of a political smear campaign, she impersonated a grieving neighbor and submitted a formal complaint to the county, claiming I was armed, unstable, and a threat to public safety. The email accused me of being a dangerous veteran suffering from PTSD, someone who had brought paramilitary mercenaries to intimidate law enforcement. She even referenced the fake police incident, twisting the facts to make it sound like I was the aggressor, not the victim. That one hit hard. I'd faced bullets, roadside bombs, and betrayal in foreign lands, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of being framed by someone in my own neighborhood. For about 12 hours, I lived in real fear that the county might believe her. After all, they don't always investigate deeply. Sometimes an accusation is enough to ruin a man. If they believed I was a threat, I could have been detained, placed on a watch list, or worse. The thought of having to legally defend myself against such a vile lie while still dealing with Dolores's harassment was almost too much to bear. But then Ralph came through in a way that still amazes me. His background in IT turned out to be far more useful than I ever imagined. He managed to trace the IP address of the email that was supposedly sent by a concerned neighbor. It didn't come from a grieving widow. It came straight from Dolores's home Wi-Fi network. She hadn't even bothered using a VPN. The woman may have thought herself clever, but she clearly had no concept of digital forensics. Ralph also uncovered several other fake email accounts she had created, dozens of them. She'd been writing to herself, faking community support for her policies, and then quoting these fake emails during HOA meetings to justify her decisions. It was textbook manipulation, divide and conquer by illusion. She hadn't just abused her position, she'd invented an entire parallel reality to support her reign. Then came the moment that changed everything. Gary, another neighbor I barely knew at the time, approached me privately. He was calm, measured, but there was fire behind his eyes. He told me he'd been quietly investigating Dolores on his own. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. But when he said, "I used to be a detective," everything clicked. Gary was a retired police investigator, white-collar crimes division. And what he had uncovered was about to blow the entire operation wide open. He had traced financial irregularities in the HOA books back nearly 3 years. Funds that were supposed to be allocated to community maintenance had been funneled into shell corporations. From there, they disappeared into property transfers, offshore accounts, and mysterious consulting fees. The real kicker? Every single one of those shell companies had ties to a major development firm, Pinnacle Resort Corporation, and several of them were linked directly to members of Dolores's family, including her nephew. It wasn't just harassment or greed. Dolores was orchestrating a full-scale land acquisition. She'd been pressuring elderly and financially vulnerable homeowners to sell their properties at below-market prices, buying them through front companies, and bundling the neighborhood together piece by piece. Her goal? To sell the entire community as a luxury resort development site. She stood to make over $2 million once she had enough properties secured. That stupid fence dispute? That wasn't about property lines. That was about delaying and intimidating me, because my house was one of the final puzzle pieces she needed. By the time we called the emergency HOA meeting, we had 78 out of 85 household signatures. People were ready. They were angry. And they wanted the truth. That night, the community center was packed to capacity. Every chair was filled. Dozens stood in the back and along the walls. I'd never seen that room so tense, like a powder keg waiting for a match. Ralph started the presentation. Slide after slide. Financial data. Sworn statements. Digital evidence. Email trails. Voice recordings of fake police officers admitting they were hired. Every piece was methodically laid out for the crowd to see. Dolores sat in the front row, her composure slipping. Her smile faded. Her fingers trembled. At one point, she reached for her water bottle with shaking hands, her designer pearls clinging to her neck like they were trying to escape. Then she stood. And she went on the offensive. Dolores claimed Ralph had been sued for malpractice, completely false, and then turned her attention to me. She painted me as a disturbed combat veteran, dangerous, mentally unstable. She claimed I had organized a militia and was using fear tactics to terrorize the community. Her voice wavered with feigned emotion, every sentence designed to trigger fear and doubt. And for a terrifying second, it worked. People hesitated. They whispered. Some looked at me like they didn't recognize the man standing in front of them. That's when Gary stepped forward, holding a folder like it was a loaded weapon. "She didn't just steal from the HOA," he said, his voice hard. "She sold us out." And with that, the room shifted. Gary opened the file and revealed every document. Bank statements. Property records. Correspondence between shell companies and developers. Dolores had sold our neighborhood's future for a payout. Every citation, every harassment, every lie, it was all part of a larger scheme to strip this community of its identity and sell it to the highest bidder. And that night, in front of our entire neighborhood, her empire collapsed. It was never just about my fence. That was only the bait. The real goal had always been much bigger, forcing me out so that Dolores could complete her quiet little land grab. When Gary, the accountant who had been digging through public records for weeks, finally dropped the folder in front of me, I knew the storm was just beginning. Inside were documents proving that Pinnacle Resort, a development company known for turning quaint communities into generic luxury retreats, had already wired a sizable deposit to an escrow account. But here was the catch: the money was contingent on them acquiring every last property in our neighborhood. It hit like a sledgehammer. Every code violation. Every noise complaint. Every inexplicable fine or citation that seemed minor at first but escalated into something life-disrupting. It hadn't been random. It was all part of a well-coordinated strategy to make life so unbearable that people would rather sell and flee than stay and fight. When I shared the evidence at the emergency HOA meeting, the atmosphere turned from skeptical to seismic. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood up in disbelief. Voices overlapped, some in anger, others in utter heartbreak. You could actually feel the moment it sunk in. The betrayal. The manipulation. The loss. People realized they hadn't just been unlucky, they'd been targets in a long con designed to strip them of their homes and dignity. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow who'd lived in the community for over 30 years, began sobbing uncontrollably. Between her tears, she recounted how Dolores had warned her repeatedly about supposed structural damage in her late husband's house. "She told me I'd go bankrupt if I didn't sell before the inspections came," she cried. "I thought she was helping me." The room went silent except for her quiet weeping, and someone rushed to comfort her. Then Frank spoke. He admitted that he too had been pressured: calls, unannounced visits, even anonymous notes warning him that staying in his house would be a financial death sentence. He never pushed back, he said, because he felt isolated and unsure. "I just didn't know who to trust anymore." 3 other families had already sold their homes and moved away, thinking they were making smart decisions. They had no idea that the fair market offers they'd accepted were a fraction of what the land was actually worth. They weren't just outmaneuvered, they were robbed, plain and simple. As the evidence mounted, the mood in the room turned from shock to fury. It was like discovering your house had been eaten through by termites, except these termites had names, titles, and wore power suits to monthly board meetings. This wasn't just about me or some petty HOA politics. This was about a systematic effort to dismantle an entire community, neighbor by neighbor, for financial gain. It was about the elderly who were guilt-tripped into leaving their memories behind. About the young couples who were told their kids would suffer because the school district lines would change. Dolores had weaponized fear, and she wielded it with surgical precision. When Dolores tried to speak, her mouth moved but no sound came out. She scanned the room for allies but found only the sharp stares of people she had quietly crushed. Her perfectly manicured facade, lipstick, pearls, heels, all of it cracked in an instant. I watched the panic ripple across her face, watched her hands shake as her breath came in sharp gasps. And I knew, she knew it was over. Her nephew, who had been sitting in the back trying not to draw attention, quietly rose from his seat. But before he could slip out, a small group of residents blocked his way. The message was clear: no one was getting out of this reckoning. The vote of no confidence was swift and thunderous, 81 votes to 2. Only Dolores and her nephew voted to keep her in power. And as she stood, her heels clicking against the tile, no one spoke. No one had to. She walked out in silence, not escorted but exiled, drowned in the truth that had finally caught up to her. But here's the thing. Most people thought that was the end of the story. The villain exposed, the power stripped, the community saved. They thought justice had already been served. They were wrong. Because as I sat there, watching Dolores disappear into the night, I was holding on to one final secret, one last card I hadn't played yet. A card that would shift everything. Less than 48 hours later, the county district attorney's office launched a formal criminal investigation. Apparently, the documents Gary had found weren't just incriminating, they were radioactive. Financial records. Shell company trails. Forged contracts. All of it pointed to a massive real estate fraud ring that extended far beyond our little neighborhood. The FBI's white-collar crime division showed up to coordinate with local authorities. What started as a neighborhood feud exploded into a regional scandal. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters. Bloggers. Even a major network news team called to ask about the fence and the phony police report Dolores had orchestrated. Our neighborhood was suddenly national news. The local paper's front page read, HOA president accused in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. As investigators dug deeper, the scale of Dolores's operation became horrifyingly clear. She had orchestrated similar takeovers in 4 different counties, always targeting quiet communities with aging populations and weak oversight. The total fraud amount? North of $6 million. But the twist that shook me most came from her own blood. Her nephew, now facing federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy, decided to cut a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he laid everything bare. He had dozens of voice recordings and hundreds of emails, each one painting Dolores as the architect of the whole scheme. The manipulation. The threats. The financial coercion. He said she'd threatened to disinherit him, ruin his construction business, and make sure he'd never work again if he didn't play along. He was just 28. Listening to his testimony, I didn't hear a hardened criminal. I heard a scared kid caught in the gears of something much bigger than him. A kid torn between loyalty and legality. And for the first time, I felt pity. Not for Dolores. Never for her. But for the boy she turned into a pawn. As he cried on the witness stand, describing years of psychological warfare from the person who raised him, something shifted inside me. Maybe betrayal isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's the only way to crawl out from under someone else's shadow. Through his cooperation, the full picture came into focus. Dolores had been planning this scheme for over 5 years. She studied property values. New zoning loopholes. Identified elderly homeowners and widows who could be pressured. She was strategic, patient, and utterly ruthless. Ralph and the new HOA leadership worked tirelessly to unwind the mess she left behind. Legal teams pored over fraudulent contracts. Forensic accountants traced stolen money. And slowly, piece by piece, the damage was undone. Mrs. Thompson got her house back, at full value, plus restitution for emotional distress. Frank and others who hadn't yet sold were able to stay without fear. Property values rebounded. The toxic fear lifted. The court ordered Dolores to sell her own house to pay restitution. She now faced 3 to 5 years in federal prison, depending on her cooperation in the ongoing investigations. Her accounts were frozen. Her emails shut down. Her construction trucks, once parked like trophies, vanished overnight. On a gray Tuesday morning, I watched her load cardboard boxes into a rented U-Haul. From my kitchen window, she looked like a ghost of her former self. Her age, once masked by wealth and cosmetics, was now undeniable. She looked hollowed out. She was moving to live with relatives in a small town far from here. Somewhere no one knew her story. Yet I doubted she'd ever escape it. And finally, with new leadership, something beautiful happened. Our neighborhood began to transform, not just physically, but spiritually. We planted trees. Held block parties. Cleared trash from the sidewalks and shared tools for yard work. People waved again. Smiled again. Laughed. Because we weren't just rebuilding homes, we were rebuilding trust. After Dolores's conviction, it felt like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled a breath we didn't realize we'd been holding. Her iron grip on the HOA had finally broken, and the residents began to rebuild what she had nearly destroyed. What followed wasn't some dramatic, overnight transformation. It was slow, deliberate, human. But every step we took felt like another layer of fear and resentment peeling away. People came out of their homes, sometimes literally. We started seeing each other not as threats or nuisances, but as neighbors again. Front porches became places to sit and wave rather than hide behind. Someone organized a weekend barbecue, just a few folding tables, cheap burgers, and mismatched chairs, but it felt like a declaration. We were taking our community back. We were saying, this is ours now, and we're not letting it rot. The new HOA board was a complete reversal of the old regime. These weren't cronies or figureheads. They were real people who had endured the chaos, just like the rest of us. They made the finances public, posted the numbers on the community bulletin and emailed breakdowns to every homeowner. They held open forums where we could actually voice concerns without fear of retaliation. When a family worried about increased foot traffic near their home, the board didn't threaten fines. They listened. And they acted. We even restarted that park renovation project Dolores had hyped up in her speeches but never planned to finish. This time, it wasn't a PR stunt. Volunteers showed up with gloves, tools, and time. We pulled weeds, laid mulch, repaired playground equipment, and painted benches. Kids started showing up again. Laughter returned. And I found myself standing beneath the same pine trees where I'd once feared fake cops would storm my door, now watching toddlers chase bubbles while parents sipped lemonade in lawn chairs. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. For the first time since moving to Montana, I felt like I truly belonged. Not just as a property owner, but as part of something real. A community with flaws, sure, but also with heart. A place where people looked out for each other, where past wounds didn't dictate future trust. Everyone thought the story ended there. The heroic veteran takes on the corrupt HOA president, wins the fight, and helps bring peace to a neighborhood poisoned by greed. It was neat. It was clean. It was satisfying. But it wasn't the full truth. Because the biggest truth of all was still hidden. And what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about this war. It was 6 months after Dolores's conviction. The neighborhood had settled into a rhythm of peace, and I had returned to my own routines. I continued teaching survival classes to local youth groups. We practiced fire starting, orienteering, basic first aid, skills I'd once used in places far less forgiving than this sleepy mountain town. It was my therapy. My way of giving back. And maybe, in some unspoken way, my way of staying ready, in case another battle ever came. Dolores had disappeared from our day-to-day lives. Last I heard, she was working at a small-town diner off the highway, awaiting sentencing while trying to scrape together a life from the ashes of her own making. The fake officers she hired had received probation and were serving community service hours. Her nephew, who'd played a supporting role in the conspiracy, was now rebuilding his construction company under tight court supervision, desperately trying to pay restitution and regain some semblance of a normal life. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The community had healed. People were ready to move on. But I wasn't. Because I was carrying a secret. One I'd buried so deep, even I sometimes forgot how much weight it carried. Until the day I received a letter. It was hand-delivered to my mailbox, forwarded from Dolores's old address. There was no return name, no signature inside, but the moment I saw the handwriting, I knew. Dolores. She always misspelled separate as separate. A quirk of hers I'd once mocked silently but now felt like a fingerprint burned into the paper. The letter was strange. No threats. No accusations. Just sorrow. Regret. She acknowledged what she'd done. The pain she'd caused. The lives she'd wrecked. And while she didn't ask for forgiveness outright, she admitted she didn't deserve it. Her words read as if they'd been scratched out in a single night of raw reflection. But one line froze me in place. If you still have photos of Tom's old flower garden, I hope you'll plant it again. Tom's flower garden. There was no way she should have known about that. I never spoke about it to anyone in the neighborhood. I never posted photos. It was Tom's sacred space, a patch of land that bloomed only for him. Roses, irises, lavender, planted in a spiral he called the Hope Ring. It wasn't just a garden. It was a statement. And for her to know about it? It meant she'd been watching me long before this story began. That's when I knew, I had to tell the truth. People thought this war began when I moved to Montana. When Dolores sent that first letter. When she tried to control me. But it started long before that. It started 5 years ago, when I lost Tom. And no, he didn't just die from stress or old age. Tom was targeted. Harassed. Pushed out of his home by a different corrupt HOA in a different state. They wanted his land for development. Pressured him with threats, legal fines, and surveillance. The stress broke his body before it broke his spirit. He sold his house, packed up, moved inland, and a week later, his heart gave out. He died alone, surrounded by boxes he never had the strength to unpack. I knew then what I had to become. A professional HOA hunter. I spent the next 2 years researching the worst of them, property cartels disguised as associations, led by petty tyrants who used fines, bylaws, and fake authority to destroy lives and steal land. I traced their connections. Built case files. Memoized patterns. And when I found Dolores's name linked to similar fraud in Montana, I made a choice. I didn't stumble into this war. I walked into it. I bought my cabin in a location I knew would make me a target. I designed that fence to trigger her wrath, an intentional violation. The cameras I installed weren't just for protection. They were evidence traps. My Navy friends didn't visit by chance. I called them, told them the plan, and they stood ready, because they knew what Tom meant to me. They'd known him too. Everything Dolores did, I anticipated. Every escalation, I calculated. I baited her step by step, drawing out the full extent of her corruption until it was too big to hide. I didn't just want to win. I wanted to expose her so thoroughly, so publicly, that no other HOA tyrant could ever feel safe doing the same again. And I succeeded. But standing in Tom's old flower patch, reading her letter, I began to wonder, had I gone too far? Had I simply become the more strategic monster? I opened an old cabinet tucked beneath a false panel in my study. Inside were files no one had seen. Photographs. Bank transfers. Real estate maps. Victim testimonies. Dolores wasn't acting alone. There were more like her, developers, fake inspectors, corrupt attorneys, working in a quiet syndicate across 4 states. I had all the proof. But now, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Because here's the thing. Dolores broke. I saw it in her handwriting. I saw it in the way she left that diner job address as her contact, a far cry from the country club president she used to be. Maybe some part of her truly regretted what she did. Maybe not. But the system she represented? That never regrets. It adapts. Even in her downfall, she almost won. She hired a private investigator to fabricate evidence against me, accusations of instability, weapon stockpiling, paranoia. But something in that man shifted when he stepped foot on my property. He saw the truth. He flipped. Gave me her instructions. Testified against her in court. He became the final nail in her coffin. Irony, in its purest form. And that garden? It's blooming again. I planted it the day after reading her letter. Barefoot, with my hands in the soil, I remembered Tom's words about hope. It's not a feeling, he used to say. It's a stubborn habit. That garden wasn't for grief anymore. It was for healing. For fighting with something more than anger. I don't keep my legal files for protection anymore. I keep them for remembrance. For the ones who still need someone to stand up when the system turns on them. Because real victory? It's not about destroying your enemy. It's about protecting the innocent. And maybe the lesson here is simple. When they come for you, when they try to take everything, your peace, your property, your life, you don't have to shout. You don't have to fight like they do. You just have to stand. And if you're still reading, thank you for sticking with me through this. If this story meant something to you, there's a little thanks button below. It helps us keep these stories coming. Catch you in the next one. Signing off for now. But remember, the drama? Oh, it never sleeps. The end.